Hi, thank you all so much for joining us today. Before I hand over to our incredible panel, I just want to give a little bit of housekeeping. This is obviously our No More Global Dialogue series. It's a recorded webinar. We have our Q&A turned on, and we'll either be answering questions as we go through the session or have an opportunity towards the end for you to ask questions directly to the panel. You have joined, you are as a participant, so you aren't part of the recording. So just to give you a heads up on that, we will share the recording along with subtitles at a following date. And yeah, I'm really chuffed for us to be all together on this, and in particular talking about this topic. It's Pride Month in the US, it's Pride around the world, and I think it's a great opportunity for us all to start considering the unique experiences that people from the LGBTQI+ community have when it comes to domestic and sexual violence. So let me go ahead and introduce the panel, and let's start with Festus, who is joining us from Kenya, which we're incredibly grateful for. He works with an organization called Q Initiative, which is an LGBTQI+ led, an LGBTQ serving organization. He's a social worker by training, specializing in human rights, sexuality development, sexual reproductive health and rights, gender justice, violence prevention and response, HIV/AIDS programming, mental health, wellness, and capacity building. A lot of stuff there. Thanks so much for joining us. I think the key thing in all of this is that he is very much focused on working to end gender-based violence, and in particular considering the role of men in prevention. Can I then go ahead and introduce Jared, who's joining us from Australia, and we're really grateful that he's with us. He's early hours of the morning and jumped on this to have this discussion with us, so incredibly grateful. Jared is the director at LGBTQ GB Awareness Foundation. He has a diverse career background, including professional work for non-governmental organizations. Jared utilizes his skills and expertise in grassroots organizing, communications and stakeholder engagement to support and promote Sydney-based and national organizations advancing the interests of the LGBTQI+ community. Jared's passionate about increasing visibility for the LGBTQI+ community, creating the environment for important conversations to take place around issues facing the community, and empowering people to be the authentic selves in their workplace, schools, and community. Thank you so much, Jared, for joining us. And I'm really chuffed to introduce Michael, who's joining us from the US. And Michael is the co-founder and executive director of Forge, which is an organization focused on improving the lives of transgender individuals by building strong connections, providing resources, and empowering growth through knowledge. Michael's educational background is in psychology with an emphasis in trauma. Michael's work on violence against transgender and gender non-conforming individuals is groundbreaking, stressing the intersectionality between complex components of identity, experience, and social contracts that both spur violence, as well as a catalyst for healing for individuals and communities. I am thrilled to have all three of you with us. And actually, the fact that we're going to have perspectives and understanding and increase our understanding for all different parts of the world will be incredibly interesting. And so I'd love to jump into our conversation and allow you all a chance to start talking and to be quiet. So let's go into that first question. And I think it's the right question for us to start with. It's just really, what are some of the unique challenges faced by the LGBTQI+ community who experience domestic and sexual violence? And in particular, what is it, or what unique experiences are there in the US, Kenya, or Australia? And most importantly, how can we all work together to overcome some of these challenges? Shall we jump in and ask Jared to start?
Would love to. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Jared, pronouns he, him. I am calling you from down under here in Sydney, Australia. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I think this question is actually a huge question, and we could probably spend most of the session talking about it. But I guess from an Australian perspective, as the introduction said, the government here recognises that this issue is at epidemic proportions. And last year we had the new national plan to end violence against women and children released, and LGBTQ plus experiences and perspectives were included within that plan. And I think that presents one of the challenges we face here, in that, you know, our experiences and you know, the strategy to end DV in our communities is part of you know, a gendered box and a gendered plan to start with. We need to be at the table. We need to be talking about it. But I think that highlights probably one of the fundamental issues that we face. There's a huge lack of research, but what we do know is about 2 in 3 have experienced some form of domestic family sexual violence in their lifetime, and only 70% have told anyone about that. 70% have not told anyone about that. So, you know, shining a light on that issue, we suspect that there's probably a lot more out there than what that limited research shows. And, you know, we know that in tackling it, you know, the tactics are very different. Many drivers are the same, but it may look a bit different. You know, you know, it's viewed through the gendered lens, and we need to tackle those institutional biases that exist, whether that's first responders, the support services, government strategies, government plans, and then also within our community. You know, there's a lot of misunderstanding and you know, biases within ourselves that we need to look at, particularly when it comes to our relationships and how we support each other. So I know that it doesn't really go to a lot of specifics, but I think you know, it lays the landscape here in Australia and what we're facing. So, you know, to the second part of that question, how do we overcome that? I think it's having more of these conversations. We need to shine a light on it. We need to educate ourselves. You know, we need to you know, step up and actually be leaders and not be afraid to have these conversations in a very safe and respectful way. You know, everyone's on a very different journey, but we know that, you know, we probably all know a victim survivor or a person with a lived experience, and we probably all know a perpetrator as well. And that's something that's often not talked about in our community. So I might leave it there because I could go on for a while, but I'm conscious of time as well. So we can keep moving through.
Thanks so much. I think maybe we'll pop back to you to add a little bit more. Festus, do you want to have a little bit of an opportunity to answer that question, and obviously then come to you, Michael, for your thoughts?
Yes. So I'll try not to repeat what Jared has talked about. So I'd say in Kenya, the biggest, one of the unique challenges that we face is criminalization, because like out of the 69 countries that criminalize same-sex relations, 33 of them are in Africa. And we have a penal code that you know, that criminalizes same-sex acts, which informs homophobia and transphobia, because now even people don't have full access to information that, you know, about queerness, about relationships, because many people operate from fear, and that has led to, you know, misinformation about, you know, the kind of society that we have, like, or the kind of queer relationships that we face, and the kind of queer relationships we have, and, you know, what and what is legal, and what is illegal. So there's like a gray area, and that has meant that when people feel excluded, they form sub-communities or communities where they feel safe, and it's in these communities where violence is, you know, where they face violence. And because of the fact that you're criminalized, you don't know whether someone can actually listen to you or support you. So we have instances where there's violence within the community in terms of, within the LGBTQ spaces, in intimate relationships. We have violence that is faced. We face violence from outside, which again, which we can't report, because there's always that aspect of, if you are not that gay, or if you're not gay to begin with, you didn't face the violence. And then there's, there's other forms of for a very long time, people couldn't say that intimate partner violence or domestic violence happens to them, because the information we had was it only happens, in married couples, and so we were like, oh, that's a heterosexual thing. But then when you got information about, the various forms of violence that take place in intimate relationships, and that's when people were like, oh wait, then that happened to me. So then I think not knowing the forms of violence that we face, and then taking things, I don't say taking this for granted, like assuming things are the norm, assuming violence is the norm, because we're used to not being cared for, we're used to not being listened to or heard. So people have internalized a lot of violence, and it took a very long time for us to actually say, hey, we need to talk about violence and violent behaviors within the community. And one of the shocking things was someone would say, oh yes, I beat my girlfriend, I have anger issues, or I have this, or my partner and I, it's fighting is routine. And it takes a lot for people to actually know that that's wrong. So I think that's one of the challenges that you're facing, actually, that there's lack of information around, what's wrong, like people don't see violence as, they see it as a norm. They don't see it as something that, that's abnormal. And the other thing, okay, it's not necessarily unique, but it's discrimination. And discrimination in the sense that you're not able to, there's discrimination from within the community as well. Like if you can't even come out as, as a survivor of violence, because people will be like, wait, there's that, that there's just terrible attitudes towards violence and towards survivors of violence. So that's one. There's also discrimination from service providers. And I think Jared has talked about institutional bias, where people can't, where people still, even if you go to report, instead of addressing whatever took you there, like maybe if it's the police station, or if it is, a healthcare worker or something, it starts with interrogating why you allowed this to happen to you. So that one is a challenge, and it's directly linked to criminalization. And and I think the community attitudes, and I want to look inwards first before we go outwards, because as much as we have like a community of chosen family and etc, and of queer people organizing outside the bigger society, whatever attitudes are, whatever the larger society has as attitudes towards violence is what we are mirroring in this community of ours that you're creating. And it's usually around hegemonic masculinities, it's patriarchy, it's power over, and that's how and that's what we see reflected in the community. So I'll stop at that point.
Wow, you've touched on so many things that we can continue talking about. So I will come back and ask you a couple more questions. But obviously, Michael, please, what are your thoughts on what's happening in the US and unique experiences?
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting to hear two people first, and then be able to kind of build off of that. So I kind of wanted to pull some of the themes, which are like the behaviors of abuse are not always recognized within queer and trans communities. And so that can look a lot of different ways to different people. We work mostly with trans folks who can be queer, of course. But, one of the things that we see and hear so often is that like trans women sometimes think, it means that I'm a woman if I'm sexually assaulted, which is kind of a profound thing to think about. But, we come from it from that perspective of like, what does it mean to be a woman in our culture? What does it mean to be a man in our culture? What does it mean to be something other than male or female in all of these miraculous, wonderful spaces beyond those two gender points? But we don't give much space for education, for acknowledgement of abuse that happens to folks who are not heterosexual, who are not cisgender, who are not all of those people that fall in those boxes. So one of the things that I heard in just the introductions and what some folks have said is the language that we use sometimes reinforces those biases. And we don't mean them to, but it's the language that we grew up with if we've been around for a while in this field. But when we use things like gender-based violence or how men can stop abuse, that reinforces in some ways some of the paradigms that make queer and trans people feel like, oh, this doesn't happen to me because I'm not a woman. I can't be being abused because my abuser was trans or my perpetrator was female. So when we have some of those languages, and I'm not picking on anybody that uses those language pieces, but it reinforces the kind of the undercurrent that queer and trans people are not affected by what's going on, and it's happening at higher rates with queer and trans people. The other unique thing I was thinking about with United States right now, and Festus talked a little bit about it by talking about criminalization, and in the US right now, we have forms of criminalization not nearly as severe as what's going on in some parts of the world. But when we have some of the current legislative bans on who could read what books, what kind of sex ed or healthy relationship curriculum can exist, or what it can include, we're oftentimes not teaching queer and trans kids that what these things are is healthy, what some of these other things are is not healthy. So we're getting a bunch of youth now who are very well informed through their social media networks, through their peer-based networks, but they're not getting education from their schools, from possibly their religious institutions, from some of those places, because it's now legislatively tamped down. So I think that that's an interesting thing that's mirroring parts of the world that have really severe criminalization and repression of things, but it's having some really interesting effects in queer and trans communities here in the US, just based on what's happening currently. The only other thing that I wanted to add right now, and we have more questions that will bring out some of these concepts, is that trans people have a lot of negative experiences with service providers in general. And so when thinking about, hey, this did happen to me, I'm not sure if it's abuse or not, can I go see somebody about it? There's a lot of prior negative experiences, so people wonder, should I go see somebody? Let alone, should I disclose what happened to me? Do I have to disclose that I'm trans or queer, in addition to I was sexually assaulted or am in a violent relationship? So some of those pieces really play a role in what some of those negative experiences are.
Thank you so much, Michael, for being able to pull all of that out of those conversations from both what Jared and Vesta said. I think the thing sort of that really resonates to me is the fact that it's the experience of having not only to say that you've experienced domestic or sexual violence, but also the fact now you're having to disclose to people the fact who you may not have chosen to disclose to otherwise, that you are in a same-sex relationship, or if you say you're non-binary, you're queer, or you're trans, and actually that then becomes something that you're now being discussed, that's been discussed and becomes the focal point and not your experience. I think it's like you say, our services and what we offer across the sector can quite naturally do that, and it creates a very formal barrier and gives us sort of our first thinking point about how we can adapt and do better. Sort of moving on into that space of how we can do better, how can we create those safe and supportive environments? I mean, I think everyone sort of highlighted the fact that when we talk about domestic abuse or sexual violence, we need to be able to see ourselves in that literature and in those campaigns, those awareness pieces. But what more can we do in that space, do you think? Should I come to you first, and then perhaps Michael afterwards, and then Jared following?
Yes. What can we do? I think, wow, eliminating all forms of violence. And I know that's a really big, broad statement, but as long as violence still continues to happen in the larger societies, in the larger spaces that we occupy, and justice is, continues to be elusive, because as much as we tell people, report if you can, seek help and etc., but that's it. It's very survival. We don't get cases of perpetrators of violence being, being brought to book, or we don't have, there's no justice. Yeah. So I think, and while we focus on the survivor and we're like, yes, let's make, let's, take care of you, we still have reading, we still have more violence coming up, yeah? And so I feel like eradicating all forms of violence is one thing, creating safer societies. And then the other thing is investing in communities. I would say, again, also sounds really broad, but we really need to have a support system where everyone feels, where communities look out for each other. Because as is, domestic violence is seen as, an issue between two people. Sexual violence is seen as, something that, is not a community thing. But how do we set up communities where we are actually very honest about, about these things, and we can talk openly about violence, and and not just talking about it from the point of how to take care of yourself, how to prevent assault, but how do we take care of each other in such a way that we are ultimately removing or getting rid of violence. The other thing I think I'd also say is education. Like, many people don't know forms of abuse or forms of violence as it happens to them. So as early as from as early as I don't know when CSE can be taught from basic social education, but from as early as as young as from a very early age, we need to be able to tell people this is right, this should not happen to you without your consent, and so on, so that that bodily autonomy, that having bringing up young people or children who are self-aware, who have the necessary information, and who feel affirmed and loved and such. I think that one has a way of creating a safe and supportive environment, and not just so that at least we will be leading with empathy and not just I don't know. I feel like we need multiple things to take place at the same time. Yes, we need our court system to work. We need our justice system to work, because we need human beings to care for each other and to have empathy for people. We also need to we need to change the language used around violence and survivors. Like the way it's very centered on survivor and not on the violence itself that happened. So those are the few things I can say. I know I've just thrown words everywhere, but I think those are the critical places we need to start. And communities take on different forms. It can be from the family setup. It can be from it can be from the place, whatever place people call home, or whichever place people find information and inspiration from. That's where we need to start. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think you're hitting on that point of the community is something else that No More have really been focused on over the past 10 years, is that we all have a role in responding. And if it's from that very first sort of disclosure to you that you're able to signpost, but actually that you're able to respond with care, compassion, and empathy and understanding is really key. And I think that's the very, very first starting point, is that what we can do as individuals. But handing over to Michael to add some wisdom to that.
You. One of the things that we typically bring forward and train about is reminding providers that when they do their job, when they stay focused on doing their job, they do their job well. And that's with queer folks, with trans folks, with basically anyone. And I'm not trying to kind of dumb that down, but I think a lot of times providers get distracted by, oh, someone's queer, someone's trans, and they get off on a tangent and don't focus on what they need to focus on, why that survivor is there. So that's a broad way of saying, when an organization is trauma-informed and creates a trauma-informed space, when an organization is survivor-centered and survivor-focused, that organization is it's going to likely do a really good job with trans and queer survivors. So again, that's a really generalized thing, and it doesn't really take into consideration some of the specifics that we need to care about and we need to focus on. So just to kind of bring in a couple of those unique things that are not just about, oh, let's be trauma-informed and survivor-centered. Do we ask people about their name and pronouns? Do we have forms that have the ability for people to share what their pronouns are, what their name is, to make sure that they have language access around what and how they refer to their experiences and their communities? Do we have an organization that serves all genders of people in an equitable, equal, fair way? So not just groups for women, but then, oh, there's another group for trans and queer people. But are all services available to all people that walk in the door? Do agencies address bias? And that can be with other clients, with staff members. How does bias show up? And is it addressed at the time, in an appropriate way? So that's both implicit or explicit bias. And then, are there things like, do we have policies, procedures, practices that overtly detail things like equity and inclusion and fairness and respect and all of those things that we want survivors to experience? So are there things that are specifically trans focused or queer focused that will really allow folks to receive the same services as everyone else? And when I think about these things about, like, how to create a safe environment, are we listening to people? And that's a really simple concept, hard to do in practice, I think, but can we really truly listen to people? Can we be informed? Are we informing ourselves in our own time, in our own space, or do we expect our clients to do that for us? Just another couple of quick pieces before things go over to Jared. Can we do things like scan our environment? So if we have a brick and mortar office, do we pay attention to what color the walls are? If there's a gender neutral bathroom, if we have magazines in the waiting room, are they all, cosmopolitan or women focused, or are they, approachable for everybody? So I encourage folks, and if someone can stick this in the Q&A chat, we've got a checklist for providers to look at, and it's really long, but it's an interesting way for people to look at, is my organization kind of responding to the needs of queer and trans folks? And I think another one of our resources that might be really useful to folks is a webinar that we did on bias. So how do people address bias, both internal or implicit bias, and external or explicit bias? So those are just a couple of resources that I would add to that list as well.
I mean, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing those. We'll make sure those are popped in either in the Q&A or attached as we send it out. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing so much insight into that. Jared, I'm sure you have your thoughts to add to it.
Yeah, absolutely, and completely agree with the points that Festus and Michael have made. I think Michael's made a really important point, which is highly relevant during Pride Month as well, is that inclusion and diversity and actually doing that in practice is more than just putting a rainbow on your door or saying that you're LGBTQIA+ friendly. And it's recognizing that every workplace has a role to play here. So, looking at policies like, reasonable use of the computer for personal time or whatever it is, because, we know as well that most people, when, they're away or looking for a safe place to find more information, it's often at the workplace. Or it's, at a neutral space, or, it's when they're accessing services. So making sure that you're actually doing it in action and practicing it well, is more than just a rainbow during Pride Month and beyond. A couple of points that I wanted to go to around that was, I think, highlighting what a healthy relationship is as well, conversely, to knowing what a problematic or unhealthy relationship is. Growing up, you didn't have examples of what a healthy queer relationship was, in the media or online. And now, I think Michael before was making the point around the use of social media and young people looking for that when, government policies are changing access to information and exposure to different groups of people and communities of people, is particularly important. So we need to shine a light on what those healthy relationships are and hold them up, whilst also educating ourselves. And I think we keep coming back to that point around individuals and individuals within a community. We all have a responsibility to educate ourselves, know what the signs are, know how to be an effective bystander, because a lot of the times in our community as well, we go, oh, well, that's just them. That's how they behave. Or, that's just that couple, that's normal part of, queer relationships. That's just what happens. Well, it's actually not. And we need to start having conversations around that. And, it's part of the reason why we hold the Awareness Day, to say that you are seen, you are believed, because a lot of the time when disclosures do happen, people are told, oh, well, that's just, guys being guys, or, whatever the circumstance might be. So we need to break down our own internal biases, break down our own understanding, educate ourselves so that we can be better role models and participants within our community.
Thank you so much, Jared. I think what you mentioned there is as a really practical option for people to do is to really think about how, if you are an employer, the tools and resources that you have can be used effectively for people to reach out and access support. And how can we enable that to happen more and more effectively is ensuring that everybody is represented in our domestic abuse policies. And they're not, like you say, just representative of a certain type of relationship, but they speak to and about everyone. It's a small piece, but often a piece that is not remembered and often neglected. We've had two really big questions where we've spoken about some really interesting pieces. I'm going to make it a dribble. I'm going to throw, we're really starting to understand to some degree. And maybe it's a case of that we're really beginning to open up and pay attention to mental health and the impact of domestic and sexual violence on mental health. And it'd be really interesting to sort of hear each of your perspectives around that. And actually, in some regard, to consider how in your respective countries, how the perception of mental health and managing your mental health and what resources are available are sort of brought into the conversation. I know, Michael, you touched very briefly on the trauma-informed approach and how that is a great way forward and the correct, and I would advocate the correct way forward for responding to the experiences of domestic and sexual violence. So I'm going to throw it into the mix and to consider mental health. And not be quite specific in the way that I asked the question. I know, Jared, you've just answered, but sort of in a way of giving everyone a chance to kick off. It's your turn to go first. And then I'll pop over to Michael and then to Festus afterwards.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, obviously there's a huge impact and huge link here. And I guess, it goes back to what I was originally talking about a lack of research as well. We don't know a lot of that, which then doesn't inform policies and priorities, and it doesn't inform responses to it. And it's a complex space because there's a whole probably multitude of feelings and emotions that contribute to someone even presenting to a mental health service. Feelings of shame, different internalized fears and thoughts, complex questions, as well as having a lack of support around an individual. So, there can be, quite a strong link in some cases, and support services and responders. It might be that the mental health issues that they're presenting with, that people are presenting with, or drug and substance abuse issues that people are presenting with, are symptoms of domestic violence or exacerbated by domestic violence. And one of the things that we find here in Australia, there's not many organisations that are dedicated to LGBTQIA plus responses. I mean, there's many organizations doing exemplary work, but they're often stretched to the limits as well. And then finding a service that's, LGBTQI plus specific, and then domestic violence related as well. You're limited to a couple in the whole country, which presents a big challenge and something that, all governments need to really look at and get behind. So I definitely think there's probably a huge impact there. It's probably been unexplored to some extent, and in others, mental health is recognized as a big issue now. amongst the population. But we have, it's hard to access. There's wait times. It's cost prohibitive. The government recognized that during COVID, increased access to it, but then that's come back again. There's this constant tension between funding and access to mental health professionals, and then finding someone that specializes in or is understanding of the queer or trans experience is few and far between, particularly if you're not living in a capital city, or living remote, or living even in a few of our capital cities, you wouldn't find some of that. So you'd find individuals specializing in it, but no central organizations. So it's definitely something that needs to be talked about a bit more. And as I say, there's some organizations doing amazing work here in Australia, and some people doing incredible work in that space too. But there's simply just not the funding to back that up.
It always comes down to the F word, isn't it? Funding. Terrible verse of it. Michael, what are your thoughts about what's going on in the US? What can we?
Yeah, I wanted to start with what Jared just mentioned, which is, kind of like there are such limited queer, trans, SADV specific resources and providers. And I think that is that's true. And because that's true, it's all the more important that mainstream providers get it and are queer and trans competent. So, I mean, just because there's a smaller number of queer and trans focused ones, it doesn't mean that queer and trans folks can't get good quality access. So, I think our job is to continue to make sure that mainstream providers are just as well as informed as any queer and trans provider spaces are. So just wanted to pull on that before more directly answering the question. So, I mean, Jared also mentioned things about shame and stigma and all of those things. So, I mean, there's a compounded effect when people have experienced trauma and they're queer or trans. So that's just another layer of those pieces of stigma and shame and isolation. One of the things that we have found, which kind of pulls off this mental health piece, is because trans people so often are gate kept or have to go through a gatekeeping model to access trans affirming care. There's oftentimes this really tense relationship between trans folks and mental health providers of if I disclose certain things like that I was abused or that I might use alcohol to cope with what's going on, that trans people then will get denied access to hormones or surgery or letters needed to access basically life affirming, let me live my life as I am and who I am. So that piece kind of threads through everything for, I think, a lot of trans folks of can I disclose my abuse to a mental health provider if I'm already seeing somebody, or is that going to deny me access to my whole life, what I need to be healthy and live in this world in a peaceful, good sort of way? And what we see a lot of times is that trans folks who are wanting to access therapy, which is not, everybody obviously, is a lot of folks end up with two therapists, one for their trans stuff and one for their trauma stuff. And I think those of us who are well enough informed about mental health, and even those who are not informed about mental health things, are going to go, well, why would you do that? Well, it's a safety thing. But why, what does that do for folks when they're segregating themselves into these two different boxes? Some information gets shared with one, some information gets shared with other. It really doesn't promote healing. It promotes this kind of segregated sense of self and a really fractured sense of being that's not necessarily well-being. So I think those are some things that are really critical for us to think about. The other thing I wanted to bring up with the US specifically is that a lot of trans folks are experiencing hate crimes in addition to sexual assault, IPV. The culture is encouraging more intimate partner violence. And our culture here in the US has become very gun prolific. There's a lot of access to guns. And those of us who work in IPV know that when there's a gun in the house, when there's a gun around, that it's more likely to have a deadly result in a relationship that has violence or abuse in it. It's also more likely that a person who might be depressed or suicidal, if they have access to weapons, is more likely to be able to complete their suicide. So I think that that's just another one of those components that's, you know, it's not US specific, but I can't think of other countries that are so gun happy as our country is, and it's quite sad that so many places, so many states in our country are having, you know, open carry laws or no permits needed, and really easy access to weapons, which again just kind of perpetuate the cycle of who has access in terms of abusers, but who has access in terms of survivors who may use that that weapon to harm themselves.
So actually we've hit on some really interesting pieces, and it's always good to hear it from a country Pacific point of view, because then we can actually see how different and the experiences are across the world. So sort of moving into that space, Festus, what are your thoughts on mental health and domestic and sexual?
So I know the impact is very big. So I won't try to even quantify what domestic and sexual violence does on the mental health, because already with the homophobia, what homophobia does is break down your sense of self. So we already people coming to this space, with distorted sense of self. People don't have not many people have place any value in their lives, or you don't have self-esteem, and being in queer spaces helps us to find ourselves, find our voice, find our community, and find ourselves worth and negotiate it, even negotiate it as we continue to occupy public space. So what violence does is I think it tells you, I think it tells you that you're not worth it. So it just takes you several steps back, yeah? So and we've seen it in cases where maybe if someone has been blackmailed, and we've seen when gay men are either blackmailed because of using, dating apps. There was a spike of that, of people going on Grindr dates, but it's a setup. And what that does to someone, people start even feeling I don't think I want to be gay anymore because of, such violence. And, and I wouldn't even talk about, the rape that, the sexual violence that queer and LGBT GNC folk face. So that was just, crazy. And then coming to in a place like Kenya, where mental health there's already stigma around mental health and seeking mental health services. Kenya calls itself a religious nation, and by religious I mean Christian. So most of our problems are solved by prayer. So you can't, people are like, where are you going to tell a problem? Tell Jesus your problems. He'll solve all of them. So already there's that stigma. So compounding that, and even when you tell someone you're going to go see a therapist, of course the first thing people think of is and it's more serious. It's not even about their personality or disorders or the psychological disorders. It's more they try to look at it in terms of psychiatric help. So already there's stigma, and we can't really say that you're talking to someone through your issues, because even your friends are like, why do you need to talk to someone about your issues? Why can't you just toughen it up and go through the same as Kenyans? There's also that stigma that mental health is something that is an import from the West. So you're it's only white people talk about their problems with therapists, Black people toughen it up, Africans toughen it up, and they go along as is. And which of course meant that having access to mental health services was very expensive for a very long time. Only few people who had information about the impact or the importance of mental health services or seeking mental health services even before you experience mental ill health is important. So of course it was expensive, and what Q Initiative did was negotiate what mental health services would look like. And I remember when we applied for our first grant, people did not even know what that was about, and it took a lot of community dialogues and telling each other, so okay, what we'll do is we will have a group therapy session just for everyone to just know what therapy is. And this came from that space of before we even started telling people to access these services or seek these services, we just had to tell them, so this is what it is. And remember our therapists during the first few months. So we did the group therapy first, and then later people went for individual sessions. And people just go there and sit and just stare at the therapist. And I think, and because it's very hard to unlearn all this, people feel like if I'm going to a therapist, I'm basically going against I'm basically going against what I've been taught about, resilience and and strength and bravery and etc. Another question is not only is access a challenge, it's also access to friendly and stroke or affirming, queer affirming services. So other mental health services you're seeking queer friendly or queer affirming. Of course, it would be great if it's queer affirming, but even queer friendly is also loose. Not very many people can say that I've actually I experienced queer friendly services. Because even the friendly is, oh, a smile here. Friendliness is allowing you into the space, but the minute you start talking about your issues, the therapist quickly reminds you that they are Christian or they have these values that they uphold, and queerness is not one of them. So I think the other question that comes with accessing mental health challenges is it reliant on donor funding? Because we know that a number of LGBTQ people are able to access therapy or mental health services because an organization or a collective mobilized resources for that. So what happens when funding is not continued? Does that mean that people don't get access to these services? And also there's this notion that I just need to go to therapy 5 or 6 times and then I'm done. But then you find that there are issues that people have lifelong relationships. Like you go to a session and you're like, wait, it's been 5 sessions, am I not better? So we also faced that challenge that people thought that going to seeking mental health services is, it's like taking tablets. I'll finish my dosage, and by the 7th day I'll be okay. But then you realize that this is a relationship that you're building with other people. So I think those are some of the questions that we have asked ourselves about, availability of mental health resources with regards to that. And Michael talked about something very important, whether queer competent, and that's a word that I'm going to be using from now on, because I think we place so much pressure on the very few therapists who are like queer affirming to really do their best. Yet we have a wider pool of people who have studied psychology or psychiatry or whatever, or they're mental health specialists, but we are not holding them to a higher standard. So that's something that also we need to really ask ourselves. I think that's all I have for now. Thank you.
No, that was so brilliant, and thank you so much for sharing that. I think the couple of pieces that jump out from what all Jared, Michael and yourself are all saying is the fact that we need to have sustainable investment so that you can have access to services that are consistent, relevant, and actually in some ways are reflective of yourself as a member of the LGBTQI community, and then in some ways that we would term in the UK as sort of by and for, that we are creating that space so that there is enough funding so specialist providers or specialist services can be delivered and accessible for more people. And I know that you spoke, all of you, in some way or at some point about the importance of community and being quite brilliant at defining community as meaning different things in different moments. Sometimes it's friends and family, sometimes it's your chosen friends and family, and other times it's the wider sort of response that we can all offer. We've had a question that came through which I thought was really important, in that how do we ensure that all service providers in communities are competent and aware and confident in providing the good support. But often when we think about domestic and sexual violence, we often sort of in a way limit ourselves to those specific services, but actually there are police and law enforcement agencies that will work specifically with victims at some point on their journey. There are schools, there are school teachers, there are mental health providers, but there's also your colleagues, your friends, people that you do sports with. So we have this wider network of people. In some ways, if you could offer something as a token of like advice or suggestions that somebody could do, what would it be as a sort of a closing remark and response? So I think I'll hand over to Michael, and then Jared, and then pieces, and then yeah. And if any more questions come into the Q&A and we have a couple of moments, I'll see if I can slot those in.
You just asked a whole bunch of different questions in that, so I'm not sure where to start with that, but can I have two small points?
Oh yes, please.
Yes, please say yes. So the one, so as I was listening, the one point is kind of related to that question that was in the chat about how do we make sure that people are basically up to date and doing the things that they should be doing. And this is where there's needs to be a mix between policy and practice. So policy needs to be, people need to get trained, people need to be up to date, and the practice is do it, right? Do it. So make sure that everybody from the front desk, through the cops, through the therapists, through the advocates, through the janitor, everybody is trained, and make sure that's in policy, and then do it. So that's one piece. And then kind of the other side of things about like, where's community? What do we do? How do we make things, better in our world for folks that are survivors? And that's what I heard the question to be a little bit. Maybe it wasn't.
You paraphrased it perfectly.
Okay, good, because that's what I heard. So it is really, really simple. And sometimes Forge does some of these, what we say is kind of soft sell items, but like, we can believe survivors. We can believe people when they come to us and tell us what's going on. It doesn't matter if we're a therapist. It doesn't matter if we're a friend. It doesn't matter who we are. If we listen and believe people, the world is going to be a lot better, and people are going to heal because they're going to feel heard. So that's my simple, like, 2-word thing of like, believe survivors, and the world will be better, not perfect.
And I would echo that 1,000 times in the fact that that action of being believed and believing somebody, that moment is a huge, powerful moment. And it's so easy to do if you're committed to doing it well. I think we're jumping over to Jared. You can answer one of those hundreds of questions that I've heard. Whichever one you
Well, I think it's a great segue to the hashtag I've got behind my shoulder here, Seen and Believe, which is the theme of this year's Domestic Violence Awareness Day on the 28th of May. There is power in that, and such power in that. And I think, to actually do that in practice is something you need to educate yourself about as well. Knowing the signs to look for, recognizing all of that, responding in a really appropriate manner as well is important when seeing someone and believing them. So that's probably the only extension I'll make to that. Michael was making some really important points around training and what organizations need to do. And I think, making sure that people with lived experiences are at the table and part of those discussions, part of that planning, part of that design is incredibly important. I've seen before, programs rolled out where, no one with any experience or user experience or lived experience is included in those discussions. So if you are looking at putting together training or putting together, inclusion practices or changing the way you work, talk to the people that you're actually wanting to help. There's mechanisms out there and groups that are more than willing to facilitate that in a very safe environment and safe way. So, encourage everyone to educate yourselves, find out more and become those advocates in the community.
Thank you so much.
So mine is a summary, or just a different way of, I don't know, but it is a summary of whatever Michael and Jared have talked about. We have to do the inner work. We have to do the inner work of unlearning and, that thing that's making us not believe people. What is it? What informs it? And how do we unlearn it? Yeah? And then the other thing, after unlearning, now how do we transform the spaces we are in? so that they equally become responsive and believes people, because it does not help that the only person who believes, but then I'm in a sea of non-believers. Yeah. So I think doing the inner work, then using this newfound knowledge to transform the system, and then holding everyone to a higher standard collectively, because it's not a one-person job. We have to collectively hold ourselves to a higher standard, a standard of care, a standard of empathy, a standard of even believing survivors. And also, and I think this, personally, this is very key for me. It's not the issue. Violence can happen to anyone. So just because I may look like, just because I think it may never happen to me, that doesn't mean that, and that's why policymakers are very far removed, it's always, and you see it in the language that is used. So once you also see yourself as, as a potential, as a victim, it takes away that, you start thinking and feeling about what the kind of responses that you want. And design, after doing that, also let's design systems and design, let's design whatever works for the community. And because that shows that you have listened to them, and you've listened and you've come up with solutions that actually works for us. So those are my 3 points. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much. I think, yeah, those final points were absolutely brilliant and give us all something to think about to, walking away with. I think sort of just to add is that I had this great opportunity to chat to all of you, but in doing that, we're able to do a little bit of research on your organizations and the work that you're doing, and that you all have an incredible cache of toolbox of resources and bits and bobs that can be really, really helpful. And I think it's really great if we have the opportunity to share that amongst each other and feel more free about hey, I found this, how can we work together? How can we develop something together? I think there's always something about sometimes we're working in silos and we're actually developing great tools and resources, but when we come together, they can be applicable and really adaptable for many people. So it's that moment I would just shout out to say that at No More, we're really grateful that we have a huge network of allies and supporters, and we hope that through joining this webinar, you've been able to meet 3 of our favorite and most influential and doing great work, and in doing that you're able to follow the work that they do and share their work. The other piece I think it was really mentioned in that is that when we're fighting for change around domestic and sexual violence, we're often fighting policymakers, and there are opportunities where we have a seat at the table or a voice can be heard. And I think what we all need to recognize is that in that moment, we need to ask ourselves, who else should be sitting with us? And how else can we widen that conversation so we are louder? And so I just want to end in the sense that we are louder together. And that actually, if we all go, we're all in a space of learning and getting things wrong and working together. And from that point, I just want to thank all 3 of you for your time and being able to sort of wake up in the middle of the morning, join us from a different time zones and share all of your experiences and your knowledge. And, it would be absolutely amazing that in a while you're able to come join us again and share some more of what your work and your organizations are doing. And if you need anything from us, as always, reach out. But if you need anything from the No More community in any way, please, we're here and we're really, really keen to be working together. So thank you so much. And for everyone that joined us, thank you so much. It always feels a bit one-sided. We're having this lovely conversation and you're not necessarily in the room with us, and hopefully one day we'll all be in a conference again together. But yeah, thank you so much. And this will be recorded and shared, and we'll see you all again soon.